The train wheels screamed against the rails one final time, and then silence. Not the silence of battlefields gone quiet after the guns stop, but something stranger. American silence. 3 Wehrmacht generals stepped onto the platform somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, their boots striking wooden planks that didn't creak with rot or splinter under their weight. August heat pressed down like a physical thing, thick and wet, nothing like the scorching dryness of North Africa, where their war had ended 3 months earlier. Cicadas thrummed in waves from the tree line beyond the fence, a sound none of them could name. Foreign and endless. Generalmajor Klaus Weber went first, his Afrika Korps uniform still bearing the dust of Tunisia despite the long Atlantic crossing. Behind him came 2 others, men who had commanded thousands, who had pushed across deserts and held strategic positions that mattered to Berlin. Now they were property of the United States Army, being processed like cargo. Weber's throat was dry. He'd been thirsty since Kasserine Pass, it seemed, since the moment Rommel's supply lines finally snapped and the British closed in from the east, while the Americans learned to fight from the west. The crossing had offered water, but never enough. Nothing had been enough for a very long time. An American lieutenant waited on the platform, younger than any officer Weber had commanded, his uniform crisped despite the heat. No swagger, no theatrical victory posturing. Just a clipboard and directions. This way, gentlemen. The English was clear, unaccented by propaganda's snarl. Weber had been told Americans were mongrels, barely capable of military discipline, a mixed rabble of immigrants who couldn't organize a supply depot, let alone an army. This lieutenant could have been Prussian in his efficiency. They walked between buildings that looked temporary but weren't falling apart. Fresh lumber. New construction. The entire camp had that quality recently built with materials to spare. Weber noticed everything now, his general's eye cataloging details even in defeat. Guard towers at regular intervals, but the guards looked bored, not cruel. Fencing that was functional, not theatrical. No dogs, no searchlights sweeping in daytime paranoia. Just a prisoner of war processing center doing its job with American indifference to drama. The propaganda had been specific. Goebbels himself had detailed America's collapse. Food riots in cities, factories shuttered by strikes, a population turning on its own government as the war drained resources they didn't have. Weber had heard the broadcasts in mess tents across North Africa. Berlin's voice crackling through static to assure them that Germany fought a dying empire, that America's entry into the war would only hasten its internal disintegration. The mongrel nation would shatter from within. Roosevelt's warmongering couldn't hide the breadlines, the inflation, the social decay. Hold on, the broadcasts promised. The Americans will break before we do. The Atlantic crossing had offered the first doubts. The ship that carried them, a Liberty ship, mass-produced, one of thousands, had been new. Not repurposed, not patched together, but new. The crew had been well fed, their uniforms fitted properly, their equipment maintained. Weber had watched American sailors throw food scraps overboard, actual food, into the ocean. In the Afrika Korps, men had fought over crusts. He'd seen soldiers trade iron crosses for tins of meat. Now, they entered the administrative building, and the doubt became something sharper. The interior was lit by electric bulbs that didn't flicker. The floors were clean. A clerk sat at a typewriter that wasn't a decade old, processing paperwork with carbon copies. No shortage of paper, no rationing of office supplies. These tiny details, individually meaningless, collectively formed a picture that made Weber's chest tighten. This wasn't a nation on the brink. This was a nation that had forgotten scarcity existed. The processing took an hour. Medical examinations by doctors who weren't rushed, who had supplies for everything, who treated enemy generals with the same clinical detachment they'd give anyone else. Weber's teeth were checked. His vision tested. A nurse, an actual nurse, not a repurposed infantryman, recorded his blood pressure with equipment that worked. She didn't speak to him beyond necessary instructions, but her indifference was more unsettling than hatred would have been. He wasn't special enough to hate. He was just another prisoner, and America had systems for this. Systems that functioned. By the time they were led to the barracks, they would house them temporarily. The sun had started its descent, and Weber's stomach had begun to voice its own opinions. They'd been fed on the ship-thin soup, bread, water prisoner rations that met minimum requirements. Geneva Convention standards, he'd been told. He expected the same here. Enough to survive, never enough to forget you were defeated. The mess hall appeared as they crossed the compound. Long, wooden, screened windows open to catch whatever breeze the evening might offer. The smell hit first. Meat. Not the ersatz protein of Berlin's chemists. Not the mystery tins that sustained armies at the edge of logistics. Actual meat, cooking. Weber stopped walking, just for a moment, and the lieutenant noticed, but said nothing. The other two generals had caught the smell too, their faces carefully neutral. Old training, keeping emotion locked away. "Dinner is at 1800 hours, the lieutenant said, checking his watch. "You're just in time." He gestured toward the mess hall. "The facilities are open to all personnel. You'll eat with the other prisoners." Other prisoners. There were perhaps 50 men already inside. German soldiers of various ranks, all captured in North Africa or Sicily over the past months. They sat at long tables, and before them, Weber's eyes couldn't process it at first. Before them were trays. Full trays. He could see from the doorway. Meat in portions that looked absurd. Bread that was white. Actually white. Not the gray substitute of rationed grain. Vegetables. Coffee steaming in cups. Butter. He saw butter on a table. Just sitting there, available. The three generals moved through the line like automatons. An American cook, some private who probably couldn't spell Wehrmacht, served them without commentary. The tray grew heavy in Weber's hands. Roast beef, the cut identifying itself as real cow, no substitution possible. Mashed potatoes with gravy. Green beans. 2 slices of bread. The butter came in individual pats. Coffee with real sugar available, actual sugar, in bowls, not rationed by the gram. And dessert. Chocolate cake. A slice of chocolate cake sitting on a prisoner's tray in the middle of a war. They sat at an empty table, the three of them, and for a long moment, no one moved. Weber looked at his fork, clean, metal, not bent or reused until it cracked, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This was prisoner food. This was what America fed its enemies. And it was better substantially, undeniably better than anything he'd eaten at the officers' mess in Berlin since 1941. Weber cut into the roast beef, and the knife went through, like the meat remembered what tenderness meant. The flesh was marbled, cooked medium, still holding juice that pooled on the plate when he applied pressure. 4 years of military service across 2 continents, and he couldn't remember the last time beef hadn't required sawing. The piece lifted to his mouth, and he chewed slowly, not from ceremony, but from disbelief. The flavor was clean, unmasked by preservation chemicals, or the metallic taint of old tins. This was beef that had been a cow recently, slaughtered and butchered with the casual confidence of a nation that had cattle to spare. Beside him, Generalmajor Ernst Hoffmann had stopped eating entirely. His fork suspended halfway between plate and mouth, a piece of potato congealing in the air. His eyes tracked across the mess hall, counting. 50 prisoners, 50 full trays, and beyond them, American guards eating from identical portions at their own tables. No officer's privilege. No separate rations for rank. The democracy of abundance. "This is a mistake," Hoffmann said quietly, in German, leaning forward. "They've given us the wrong meal. This is for their officers." But Weber had already done the mathematics that Hoffmann was still resisting. He'd seen the kitchen through the serving line 3 cooks, barely supervised, moving without urgency. The portions weren't carefully measured. The server had simply scooped, indifferent to precision, because there was more where this came from. Always more. The potatoes sat in warming trays that could serve 100 men. The bread came from crates stacked against the wall. Loaves wrapped in paper that wasn't being saved for reuse. This wasn't special. This was Tuesday. No mistake, Weber said, and ate another bite to prove his point. The third general, Oberst Friedrich Steiner, had taken a different approach. He was eating methodically, rapidly, the way starving men eat when they don't trust the food to remain. His face held no expression, but his hands moved with purpose. Fork to mouth, fork to plate, the rhythm of a man storing calories against future deprivation. Weber understood. They'd all learned hunger in North Africa, where supply trucks became targets, and the British learned to fight by making sure you had nothing to eat. Steiner wasn't tasting the meal. He was surviving it. The coffee came next, and Weber lifted the cup, inhaling first. Real coffee. Not the roasted grain substitute, not the chicory blend, not the acorn mixture that Berlin had tried to pass off as adequate. Coffee beans, ground and brewed, releasing aroma that triggered memories of peacetime, of cafes that no longer existed, of normalcy that felt like archaeological history. He sipped, bitter, hot, perfect. The sugar bowl sat within reach, white crystals that caught the light, and he spooned 2 measures into his cup with the recklessness of a man who'd forgotten sugar could be abundant. In Germany, sugar rations had been cut 4 times since 1940. Here it sat in ceramic bowls. Communal, unlimited dot around them. Conversation had picked up German prisoners who'd been here longer. Men captured at Sicily, or even earlier, talking in the casual tones of people who'd adjusted to captivity. Weber caught fragments. Complaints about boredom. Speculation about mail from home. One soldier laughing about losing at cards to an American guard. Normal problems. The problems of men who weren't wondering where their next meal originated. They feed us better than our own army, Hoffman said. His voice carrying an edge that might have been anger or might have been something worse. Better than our officers ate in Berlin last Christmas. It was true. Weber had been in Berlin for Christmas 1942, on leave between Africa deployments, and the officers' mess had served turnip stew with small portions of sausage that contained more filler than meat. The bread had been dark, dense, stretching flour with potato meal. There had been no butter, no coffee. The wine had been adequate, but only because France still produced it under occupation. Even then, even in the capital, surrounded by the propaganda apparatus that promised German superiority, the meals had spoken a different language. The language of rationing, of substitution, of making do. America wasn't making do. Weber's eyes drifted to the waste bins near the kitchen entrance, and what he saw there completed the equation that propaganda had tried to prevent him from solving. Leftover food. Actual edible food, scraped from plates, thrown away because men had eaten their fill and couldn't finish. Bread crusts. Uneaten vegetables. A half portion of beef someone hadn't wanted. In Germany, those scraps would have been collected, repurposed, transformed into the next meal through alchemy of necessity. Here they went to trash bins that would be emptied and refilled daily. A cycle of waste that implied bottomless supply. The chocolate cake should have been the final insult. But instead, it became the moment of clarity. Moist, layered, frosted with real chocolate, not carob, not the synthetic substitute that German factories had perfected. Weber ate it slowly, letting each bite dissolve on his tongue, and with each taste, Goebbels' voice faded further from credibility. Every broadcast had been inverted truth. America wasn't collapsing under war strain, it was producing dessert for prisoners. It wasn't rationing chocolate, it was serving it to enemy generals. The mongrel nation wasn't weak. It was so strong it could afford kindness without strategic cost. Hoffman pushed his empty plate away, with a sound that might have been disgust or despair. How long had they been lying to us? Weber didn't answer immediately. He finished his coffee, set the cup down with precision, and looked at his fellow officers. Steiner had stopped eating, his plate clean, his expression finally showing something beneath the military mass comprehension, arriving late, but arriving completely. They were men who'd spent careers reading maps, understanding logistics, calculating what armies needed to function. And they'd just been served proof that every calculation they'd made had been based on fraudulent data. From the beginning, Weber said finally. They've been lying from the very beginning. He stood, legs unsteady not from the meal, but from the weight of implication. I need to speak with the camp commander. The camp commander was a colonel named Patterson, a man in his 50s with the weathered calm of someone who'd stopped being impressed by rank decades earlier. He received the 3 generals in his office without ceremony, gesturing to chairs arranged before a desk that held neat stacks of paperwork, a telephone that worked, and a framed photograph of a woman and 2 children. Weber noticed the photo, not because it mattered strategically, but because it spoke of normalcy. This man commanded a prisoner of war camp and went home to a family that wasn't starving. The meal, Weber began in careful English and paused, unsure how to frame the question without sounding insane. How do you ask why your enemies are feeding you better than your own country fed you? Is this standard? Patterson looked at him with something approaching sympathy. Geneva Convention requires adequate nutrition for prisoners of war. We provide the same rations our own enlisted men receive. He pulled a sheet from his desk. Daily caloric intake, 3,200 calories. Protein requirements met through varied sources. Fresh vegetables when available, canned when not. Coffee, tea, milk. Recreational provisions, including tobacco and writing materials. He set the paper down. Yes, General. This is standard. Hoffman leaned forward. For how many prisoners? This camp holds 500 at capacity. Nationally, we're processing approximately 300,000 prisoners across all theaters. Patterson said it without consulting notes. The number is immediate and certain. All receive equivalent care. 300,000 men, fed daily, clothed, housed, guarded, processed through bureaucratic machinery that didn't break down. Weber had commanded divisions that struggled to feed 15,000 across supply lines that collapsed monthly. The mathematics became obscene when applied to American scale. This wasn't efficiency. This was excess weaponized into strategy. May we see the supply depot? Weber asked, and Patterson's eyebrows rose fractionally. Unusual request. But I don't see why not. The depot sat at the camp's southern edge, a warehouse structure with loading docks where a truck was currently being unloaded. Weber watched crates coming off in steady rhythm: flour, sugar, coffee, canned goods, medical supplies, soap, blankets. The private doing inventory worked from a clipboard, checking items against manifests with the boredom of routine. This happened every day. Every single day, trucks arrived with more than was needed, and the excess got stored in a warehouse that had room for excess. Where does it come from? Steiner asked, speaking for the first time since the meal. Patterson followed his gaze. Different suppliers. That truck's from a distributor in Philadelphia. Tomorrow's delivery comes from Pittsburgh. We requisition through standard Army supply channels, same as combat units. Same as combat units. The words hung in the humid air. In North Africa, combat units had received priority, and even they went hungry when the supply lines stretched too far or British fighters found the convoys. Support units made do with less. Prisoners would have received nothing. But here, in America, there was enough to feed everyone the same, even the enemies. Because the supply chain didn't stretch, it simply existed, vast and redundant. Immune to the kind of disruption that had defined the European war. Weber moved to a crate being opened for inventory. Canned peaches. 30 cans in the crate, and the private marked it down without ceremony. On impulse, Weber looked at the label. Packed in California, 1943. Fruit from the Pacific coast, canned this year, shipped across a continent to feed German prisoners in Pennsylvania. The logistics alone would have consumed Germany's entire trucking capacity for a week. America did it as background noise to actual war production. The next weeks became an education in industrial capacity that no military academy had prepared them for. Weber and his fellow generals, permitted relative freedom within the camp's boundaries, observed everything with the focus of men who'd built careers on understanding how armies functioned. What they learned rewrote their understanding of what was possible. Daily deliveries never stopped. Fresh milk arrived every morning from local dairies, still cold, in glass bottles that weren't being saved for recycling. Bread came from commercial bakeries with capacity to spare. Meat shipments arrived twice weekly, portions calculated by nutritionists, whose job was ensuring enemy prisoners met health standards. The casual abundance became oppressive in its consistency, but the food was merely symptom. The disease, if it could be called that, was deeper. New uniforms issued monthly, not when the old ones wore out. Medical supplies that didn't run short. A library stocked with current magazines showing American civilian life, continuing undisturbed advertisements for automobiles, refrigerators, products that Germans hadn't seen available for civilian purchase since 1939. One magazine featured a photograph of a supermarket, shelves packed with choices, and Weber spent 20 minutes studying it like intelligence photographs, trying to find the propaganda trick, the careful staging. But the detail was too complete, too casual. This was real. The camp employed German-speaking American guards, men whose parents or grandparents had emigrated, who spoke with the comfortable accent of people who'd never known scarcity. Weber talked with one corporal whose grandfather had left Bavaria in 1885. "My dad owns a hardware store," the corporal said during one evening conversation. "Business is good. War economy, you know. Everyone needs supplies." He said it without irony, without understanding that in Germany, hardware stores had been stripped for metal, their owners conscripted, their inventory requisitioned until the shops became empty spaces, marked by absence. Weber lay awake that night in a barracks with clean sheets and working heat, calculating. America's industrial production exceeded Germany's by factors that made strategic victory mathematically impossible. They'd been fighting an opponent who could lose ships faster than Germany could sink them and still gain naval superiority. An opponent who could feed millions of soldiers, millions of prisoners, and hundreds of millions of civilians simultaneously without strain. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose. The question was, when had defeat become inevitable? The answer sat in his stomach, converted from roast beef to understanding. Before the first shot was ever fired, September arrived with cooler air and the quiet realization that captivity had rhythms easier than command ever offered. Weber woke to bells that rang on schedule, ate meals that appeared without fail, and spent his days in a limbo that felt safer than any frontline posting he'd survived. The other prisoners had warned him about this. The psychological trap of American POW camps wasn't cruelty, but comfort. You could forget you were supposed to want to leave. The work details began in October. Voluntary, paid labor for prisoners who wanted activity beyond the fence line. Weber watched men sign up to harvest crops on local farms, earning 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could purchase toiletries, cigarettes, even beer from the canteen. Beer. He'd led men through minefields for the promise of beer. And here it sat behind a counter, available for purchase. Rationed only by personal budget rather than national supply. The Americans had calculated that bored prisoners caused more problems than employed ones. So they'd created a system where enemy soldiers earned wages and spent them on luxuries. The efficiency was almost insulting. Hoffman took a work detail to a dairy farm and returned that evening shaking his head. "The farmer's son is overseas," he said. "Fighting in Italy, probably. And here I am, milking his father's cows. Being paid for it, eating better than his boy likely is." The irony had weight. That American generosity extended even to putting enemy generals to work on farms whose sons were dying to defeat them. "The farmer's wife packed me lunch," Hoffman continued, his voice strange. "Sandwiches. She asked if I had enough." The camp library became Weber's refuge, though refuge was the wrong word. It was more like reconnaissance into enemy psychology. He read Life magazine's coverage of American war production, photographs of factory floors stretching into infinity, women in coveralls assembling bombers, shipyards launching Liberty ships every 4 days. The numbers accompanying the images weren't propaganda because they didn't need to be. America wasn't boasting. It was simply documenting reality. In 1943 alone, American factories had produced 86,000 aircraft. Germany's total production was 25,000. The math was genocide disguised as economics. Newspapers brought updates from Europe, carefully censored but informative enough. Italy had surrendered. The Red Army was pushing west. Allied bombing campaigns were intensifying over German cities. Weber read these dispatches with the detachment of someone watching a play he'd already left. His war was over. Germany's war continued, fed by propaganda that promised wonder, weapons and strategic genius, while the gap between promise and capability widened into an abyss that would swallow millions more before acceptance arrived. A new batch of prisoner, not Detroit. The social fracturing was happening in German cities under bombing, not American ones thriving on war production. Christmas 1943 arrived with a meal that would have been impossible in Germany: roast turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The Americans had calculated that maintaining morale required observing traditions, even for prisoners, so they served a holiday feast that exceeded what most German civilians would eat all month. Weber sat with Hoffmann and Steiner, the three generals who'd arrived together, and none of them spoke for several minutes. The absurdity had become normal, which made it somehow worse. "When we go home," Steiner said finally, "if we go home and they ask us about America." He paused, searching for words. "How do we explain this? That we were defeated by kindness? That we ate better in captivity than in service?" Weber had been thinking about this question for months. The German people had been fed the same lies he'd believed, told that sacrifice was temporary, that victory was inevitable, that the enemy was weak and decadent. But the enemy had been so strong it could afford to waste food on prisoners. So organized it could ship fresh milk across continents. So confident in victory, it didn't need cruelty to demonstrate power. "We can't," Weber said. "They won't believe us." Hell, I'm living it, and I barely believe it. Prisoners came in November, captured in Italy. And Weber recognized one, a major who'd served under him briefly in France before Africa. The man looked hollowed out, not by mistreatment, but by exhaustion of belief. "They told us American forces were undermanned," the major said that first night, eating his first American meal with the stunned expression Weber remembered wearing. That their equipment was inferior. That they had no stomach for fighting. He laughed, a sound without humor. "They came through our positions with so much artillery support, we couldn't count the tubes. Then tanks. Then infantry who were fed, rested, and had ammunition to waste." He looked at his plate. "This is what they feed prisoners?" "Standard rations," Weber confirmed, and watched the man's face cycle through disbelief to comprehension to something like grief. By December, as snow began falling over Pennsylvania fields, Weber had collected enough testimonies to construct a clear picture of how thoroughly German intelligence had failed. Prisoners from every front told variations of the same story. They'd been promised American weakness and met American plenty. The propaganda hadn't just been optimistic. It had been inverted. Every claim Goebbels made about American collapse was actually describing Germany's reality projected outward. The food shortages were in Berlin, not New York. The industrial decay was in the room. He pushed his plate away, appetite defeated by implication. "But someone needs to understand what we lost before the war started. We were fighting mathematics, and mathematics doesn't care about will or ideology or propaganda. It just counts. And America could count higher." The snow fell heavier outside, muffling sound, and Weber understood that this quiet, this peaceful, well-fed, heated quiet was the truest victory. Not tanks or bombers or strategic genius, but the simple, devastating capacity to make war without feeling it.